I'm really looking forward to sitting down with Yvonne Wingett Sanchez from the Washington Post. Her reporting focuses on how Arizona state and local officials navigate pressures on administration of elections. She's also tracking legislative and legal battles over voting rules and access to the polls. Keep Our Republic's only working in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, but election administration is certainly under the looking glass in Arizona. So I'm eager to learn from her and compare what's happening in her state with the states that we're working in.
When Ben Franklin was leaving Constitution Hall, he was asked if the founders had decided to have a republic or an autocracy. And he said, "We have a republic if we can keep it."
Yvonne, thanks so much for joining and taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
And more so, thank you for putting on some road miles and doing some incredibly insightful reporting. I'll admit I've only been to Arizona twice in my life, but I find it fascinating. I think all Americans and even folks abroad who are taking a look at the next 250 some days of American politics know that Arizona is a pretty unique place.
It is something that's become more unique and more important over the past decade and a half or so. And it's already been a wild ride, and it's already only mid-February. So buckle up.
Are you born and raised in Arizona?
Born in Acapulco, Mexico, raised in a small town outside of Boise, Idaho. I've been in Arizona for the past 22, 23 years, came here as an intern right after September 11th, actually. My mom and I drove out here, and I thought I'd be here for a few months for another internship. Ended up loving it and stayed, was a reporter for the local newspaper, the state's largest newspaper, the Arizona Republic, for a couple decades, and ended up joining the Washington Post's democracy team, which was created in 2022, and having a good time.
I don't have the census data. We don't have to dwell on it, but it sounds like this is quite normal. When we look at Arizona's demographics, I mean, there's been tremendous population growth and folks coming from all over the world, all over the country. And maybe that's contributed to the politics, but it does seem like Arizona politics have changed quite a bit in the last 2 decades.
Quite a bit. I think they really began changing, I would say, in the 2008, 2009 era, rise of the Tea Party, immigration and the border security debate has been a perennial issue, a perennial crisis off and on for the last many, many election cycles. And that has really sort of fueled a lot of angst and a lot of anxiety and a lot of the mistrust and distrust about Congress and about politicians and about people who live 2,000 miles away and seem very disconnected from what is actually happening on the ground and fail to do anything about it. We saw that with Senator John McCain back during this time frame, and John Kyle, two Republican senators who were trying to do something about the border issue. We're seeing it again today, all these years later. And as this has really grown into the issue that what it is today, Arizona's population has boomed. We're seeing a lot of transplants from California, from the Midwest, from Texas even, and they're bringing their politics with them. And sometimes they get here and they're like, oh my gosh, I was a Republican back in my, home state of Ohio, or I met this woman this other day from Wisconsin, and she gets here and she's like, holy moly, this is something completely different. And so they're re-registering or they're doubling down. Some of them feel right at home, like they came here hoping to be a part of something like MAGA World, Arizona's version of MAGA World, or they came for affordable housing, and they're bringing their either more liberal or more conservative style politics here from California. And so you've got massive numbers of transplants coming in at the same time. You are seeing huge growths and huge gains with the Latino population. And they're much more younger and tend to be more liberal, although Republicans under Trump especially have made significant gains with those voters over the past cycle or two.
Well, we could have a whole conversation, probably spend a whole weekend talking about population dynamics and what it means for resources and urban planning. And I certainly would find that fascinating, but wanted to pivot back. So give listeners a sense before we plunge into your great reporting. You mentioned in 2022, the Washington Post made this decision to have a quote unquote democracy team. and you're far away from Washington, but give folks a sense of the team nationwide and a little of what the genesis of that was.
So the genesis of the team came about after a lot of reporting by the Washington Post about the events leading up to January 6th, before, during, and after the attack on the Capitol. The idea was really to have reporters who understood what was happening in their regions on the ground to be able to really delve deeply into some of these bigger issues, into the psyches of these communities that are really driving or are gripped by election skepticism. Why? Why are they feeling this way? Who are the figures that are really sort of leading these movements? And where is government working? Like, it's not all doomsday, right? Like, there are lots of examples of things that are going right and that are going well. And so we have reporters all over the country. Patrick Marley is a reporter based in Wisconsin. He covers the Midwest. We have really intensely focused on Pennsylvania as well. Georgia, Amy Gardner and Holly Bailey are really focused on the events in Fulton County, along with a team of other reporters. And then, of course, reporters based in the Washington newsroom who've been covering this line of democracy reporting for several years now. And it really gives us much more flexibility and much more context about what is happening outside of Washington, outside of the Beltway.
Well, I want to piggyback on a phrase you just used because too much we're focusing on the negative, but you said, where is government working? And my understanding is that Governor Hobbs just recently signed legislation. It was bipartisan legislation, and maybe you can speak a little to that.
So you're referencing a piece of bipartisan legislation that came in just under the wire that essentially averts an election crisis here in Arizona. After Trump won the election in 2020 by the narrowest margin in the country, it was 10,457 votes that he lost by. Republicans wanted a bill that would ensure accuracy in the vote tally in future elections. Democrats got on board. They passed something that essentially means that more races, especially statewide races, are going to be recounted. We have 4.3-ish million voters who showed up in 2020. That's a lot of recounts. The state has become much more competitive. It's going to mean more recounts. We had an attorney general race in 2022 that was won by just 280 votes, to just give you a sense of how razor thin some of these margins are. So we brought in this bill that was going to require more recounts. At the same time, we're much more competitive. At the same time, we are up against federal and state deadlines on the election calendar, including deadlines for the Electoral College to meet and to select their electors. Given the number of recounts that election officials around the state, in blue counties, in red counties, everywhere you look, given the number of recounts they were going to expect, that meant that we were going to miss these key deadlines on the election calendar. Worst case scenario, that meant that our 11 electors would not have been included in the final tally. Obviously, that's a problem. There were a lot of things that could have happened to avert that sort of worst case scenario. There were a lot of counties that were gearing up to go to court and to proactively ask, judges, courts to tell them what to do because they were going to break the law. That was a line of questioning that we didn't get to because they were able to fix it. So after many months of talking and after a very frantic couple of weeks of negotiations last week, the governor ended up signing something into law that allows this worst case scenario to be averted, knock on wood. And it was a rare moment of consensus. It is very rare to see MAGA lawmakers, MAGA Republicans, people who do not believe in recent Republican losses from 2020 on down, all the way to progressive Democrats, actually move quickly to agree on something and send it to the governor for her to sign. That is very rare. It shows you just how concerned they were about this issue. And I have to add, there were even people like Wendy Rogers, very well-known, prominent, vocal election denier who chairs the Senate's election committee, who said in a statement, this is going to allow us to have a quick and fair election result. we'll see if that ends up holding.
So the ink is still drying as we're recording, and sounds like a net positive. We should have done this before. Just take a step back, remind listeners outside of Arizona and those that are in these weeds, the composition of the legislature, and then for that matter, is it a full-time legislature or they're only meeting now in the winter months?
The legislature is fairly evenly split, and Republicans control both chambers, the House and Senate, by just one vote. And so it is a setup that should force consensus, but there's a lot of culture war fighting, a lot of messaging bills that are being debated. And we have big fights ahead on budget and elections. And the governor is a Democrat, Katie Hobbs. She narrowly beat out Carrie Lake in 2022. And so we have a lot of people who aren't happy, basically, about Katie Hobbs being the governor. And so they're, probably going to be sending up a lot of bills to her that she's going to veto, messaging bills ahead of 2024 election. And I would expect your audience to start to hear a lot more about the basis of some of those bills and debate as it seeps into sort of the more national narrative.
Well, let's move in the second half of our discussion away from what's happening under the Capitol dome to what's happening in county government, which is by and large where the rubber hits the road for all these election administration debates that our nation's having. So I wanted to focus maybe through three different lenses: poll worker safety, combating misinformation, and then just proactive educating of Joe Q public voters on the streets of Arizona. So you've done some really incredible reporting with some very colorful quotes from everyday Arizonans and election officials. So which one of those would you like to start with?
Why don't we start with poll worker safety?
Okay, I had the word tourniquet, which came as a surprise to me, but don't want to dwell on the negative there, but maybe let's start with that.
So if we don't want to dwell on the negative, the positive on that would be that Arizona's Secretary of State, Adrian Fontes, who was the recorder here in Maricopa County, a battleground jurisdiction in 2020, he saw a lot of really scary stuff. He's a Marine Corps veteran, and he was in this vote center where ballots were being tabulated in 2020, and there were protesters led by people like, Alex Jones, and Paul Gosar was there, very prominent figures. QAnon Shaman was making his way in the days before January 6th in some of these Stop the Steal spaces. And at one point he saw, later witnessed, footage of one of his election workers being pulled out into this crowd of people, and it got him really concerned. Now he's Secretary of State. So he oversees all of the counties and collects their results and sort of helps prepare poll workers ahead of the election. And in preparing and thinking about what he thought they would need ahead of this cycle, he was preparing for worst case scenario. We spend a lot of time thinking about worst case scenario here in Arizona. And his office provided local governments, if they wanted them, these emergency services kits that include tourniquets in case there is physical violence. They could stem the bleeding. These, I don't want to describe them, but these pieces of equipment, these devices that would allow them to barricade doors in case a shooter, an active shooter, or somebody was trying to burst into their doors. They were offered all sorts of classes on how to deal with shooters, so active shooting drills, how you could turn everyday sort of office equipment from pens to keyboards into weapons to try to take somebody down. And I should note that this might be seen by some people, including democracy experts, to be like overkill, right? This could actually chill voting. This could scare voters. This could try to or have an unintended consequence of turning people away from participating in the process. But what we saw here in Arizona, and we continue to see, are death threats, lots of death threats, swatting efforts, harassing phone calls, protesters showing up at the homes of election officials and lawmakers, and anybody who sort of acknowledges that the results in Arizona are sort of free and fair. the protests that I referenced outside of the ballot counting center in 2020. You have people who are in these far-flung, very red conservative counties who are experiencing the same things and are very concerned. I talked to several people actually recently in one of these red counties. They are carrying guns around in their purses. These are women who have never carried guns before. They are carrying weapons to protect themselves. And this is just sort of where we're at. So there is a lot being done from the state level to try to make sure that these people have the tools that they need to defend themselves in the event that it comes to that. And aside from that, in Maricopa County, there are lots of other efforts afoot. There's going to be major security increases into protecting the ballot counting center. This was done last cycle during the midterms. They had horsebacks and drones, and sheriff's deputies were everywhere. The county's command center, they're going to have an emergency command center again, and anybody who needs the sort of maybe mental health services that they need dealing with some of these phone calls or physical protection as they needed in 2022 and 2020, they will get that. So ahead of this cycle, this is much more on the radar, and actually getting resources, monetary resources to pay for some of these things more so than really ever before.
There's a lot to digest. So if I'm understanding correctly, at the end of the night, when Arizona polls close, like everywhere else in the country, all the data, for want of a better term, goes to a central count facility. In some cases, like Maricopa County, it's quite large, and there might be, as you said, drones and officers on horseback. And others, it might be a very rural location with the county seat of government. But these initiatives are focused primarily there, or focused on thousands of precincts and polling locations, or both?
So in Arizona, we have vote by mail, which is very popular, and like 80% of people who vote by mail. And so most people outside of Arizona might think of like election day. We have more like election month. And so these ballots will be sent in to these various counties. The ballots will arrive, and they can't be counted. They can't be processed until election day. And so there will be prep work that will be done, like opening the ballots, but the whole process doesn't really get off in earnest until election day in terms of counting. And so we have live ballots in these election tabulation centers. It's not just electronic transmittal of results. It is, at least here in Maricopa County, these are the ballots. And because we are such a competitive state, it takes a long time to do the work needed to count the ballots, the millions of ballots that are just sitting there waiting to be counted, plus run the polling locations that are set up, hundreds of locations throughout the county. People can show up wherever they want to vote. That is something that is also sort of unique to Arizona. Lots of counties here have it. It's not based on precinct. You can show up wherever. If it's close to your work, if it's close to your home, whatever's easiest for you, you can show up at any of these places. And those ballots have to be transmitted then to the central ballot tabulation center, which is in downtown Phoenix. And all of these counties are going to have extra security, extra protocols in place to make sure that those ballots are protected and to make sure that the people who are counting those ballots are protected. And that's sort of become the new norm here in Arizona. And then eventually, once the ballots are all counted, and this is a process that can take many days, and people start to get very anxious and conspiracies start to fly online about why is it taking so long? And a lot of these people who are spreading this information, they know what they're doing. They know what they're saying is not accurate. A lot of other people might be first timers. They might be some of the transplants that we've talked about who've never really experienced what it's like to vote in a place like Arizona. So they might just be confused about the process and sort of participating in spreading misinformation or disinformation unintentionally. But it is a lengthy process in a place like Arizona, and that is perfect breeding ground for the sorts of conspiracies that we have seen before. And now this need for additional security.
Well, it's a perfect segue into the next lens, the combating misinformation. So you've done good reporting on what government stakeholders and then others in civic life are doing to proactively, hopefully, put up some maybe speed bumps, we could say. I don't think you can put up a wall, but put up some speed bumps against misinformation.
Yeah, this is an area that so many people feel so defeated about, I would say. There's no perfect answer on how to stop this. As you said, like no one is under the illusion that they're going to be able to fix this completely. Various voting jurisdictions around Arizona are going to try different things. You know, Maricopa County, which is home to most of the state's voters, they are putting up this big election command center. This is something that they tried out during the midterms. And essentially what they would do is like they would have all these reporters come in and they would show the disinformation that was spreading online. They would literally put the tweets up there by very important influencers and they would debunk the tweets. They would debunk the information. And that was sort of like a real time effort to try to be very transparent about how the process works, to set expectations and to correct falsehoods. You can never keep up with all of them, and they very clearly recognize that. The other really basic thing, sounds super basic, but in a place like Arizona that is growing so rapidly, and we do have a lot of transplants and the rules are different depending on the counties that you're in, they're putting up billboards. They're amplifying, like there's this one county, I'll be writing about this soon, they're squeezed between two major, Tucson and Phoenix. So the people in this little county are being told by the media and by election officials in these two big cities, you can show up anywhere, you can go to, go to any place. Well, in this one county, it's precinct based. So it's just, they're combating real information and fake information. And so they're putting up these big billboards along major roadways, hoping to get these commuters who are going to and from these different cities to let them know that, like, no, really, like, here are the rules. Like, you can't just show up anywhere. So they're sort of in a unique situation. We have a lot of conspiracies and misinformation that's spread about drop boxes. And these are like big steel boxes. Some of them are located outdoors. And in 2022, we had people with weapons who were showing up and they were going to try to catch, mules or people who were stuffing these ballot drop boxes filled with, other people's ballots. It led to all kinds of complaints about voter intimidation, a lot of misinformation, some fights. Like it wasn't a great situation. In Pinal County, which is again a conservative county, they're like spending money, which for them, they don't have as much as some of these bigger places. They're spending money to boost their internet capacity to just do live streams of these drop boxes. So instead of like getting your camping chair or sitting on the bed of your truck all night and watching these things and getting into it with voters, you can just watch it from watch it from bed. You can watch it from your office. Like, you don't have to show up. Is that going to stop all of this behavior? Maybe not. Could it lessen it? Perhaps. And so these people are sort of trying to meet people where they are in the voting process or in the observational process. And they're trying to do things that they can do to address some of these conspiracies and the roots of the conspiracies to try to prevent some of the hostility and the threats and the intimidation or the claims of intimidation that we have seen over the past couple of years. No one knows if it's going to work. No one expects that it's going to stop any of this completely.
I just want to take a step back. So it is not uniform across all Arizona counties. In some counties, there actually is a precinct by precinct.
Yeah.
Once again, I'm not an Arizonan. Who am I to editorialize? But why doesn't the legislature address that? That just seems like that's kind of fanning the flames of potential hiccups.
I can't answer that question.
I'm not putting you
I'll
on the
say
spot. I'm
that,
just asking
yeah,
aloud. But
yeah. I mean, they have deferred to the counties to allow like a more local control of the system. And you have counties like Pinal that are running off of this precinct-based system, and it is leading to real problems. I don't know if if actual residents have complained though about that process. a lot of these red counties, they want precinct voting. They want precinct voting, hand counting, which is impossible in a place like Arizona, according to experts. And we don't even have the space or the workforce to count these ballots. As it is, it's difficult to get volunteers to do this. But you do have a few counties that have precinct-based voting. And so it's an important distinction. And again, it leads to so much misinformation and confusion about how this really complicated system works and the enforcement of the rules and the perception of the enforcement of the rules. It all comes down to how people feel, right?
Sure. So the last lens, which we've touched on, but your reporting has done a great job and I think plays a role in, is educating voters. So there's the combating misinformation, which is therefore responding to a negative, but educating voters, I guess you would say that's more positive, proactive messaging. So maybe share a few anecdotes that you've reported on in that regard.
So in Maricopa County, they are really amplifying very basic information about the processes of voting. And so they're encouraging people to go to a website, it's called Be Ballot Ready, to learn about the ins and outs of voting. They are, again, putting up these billboards. They are going to have, I think, a pretty robust voter education effort on television, on radio, online. In places like Nevada, the Secretary of State there, Cisco Aguilar, he is really amping up his efforts in both English and Spanish, which I think is a super underrated effort that very few people talk about. And especially in the Southwest, it's really important to be able to communicate in Spanish or in some sort of bilingual way to communicate with such a large portion of the education. And it is all coming down to very key dates. It's very basic information. Update your voter registration cards. Make sure you're registered to vote. Here's when you can start voting. If you want to vote by mail, here's how you do it. If you want to show up on election day or at vote centers that open ahead of election day, here's where you can go. Here's how you can find your information. In places like Arizona, we get text messages. You can sign up for a text message. So as your ballot is received, processed, your votes have been counted, you get an alert that says, this is the status of your ballot. And it's intended to just give basic information and assurances and confidence that votes have actually been counted and that the ballot has been received. But I think it's also intended to really make people feel like they are part of the process. And if the text message makes them feel that way, it's a pretty basic way to keep voters informed of what is happening with their votes. We're going to have a lot of people who are also going to get phone calls saying, there's a problem with your vote. We got your mail-in ballot. We can't verify the signature. We really want to make sure that this is you. So they're going to be reaching out to some of those voters, either by phone, by email, by text, to try to get them to come in and what's called to cure their ballot or to fix problems with their ballot. And they're going to be much more aggressive, I think, in letting people know that that is part of the process that is normal. It has always been normal. And it is an extra effort to try to make sure that people's votes count. And so those are all the things that they're working on. There's a whole other level of things that people are talking about with artificial intelligence, manufactured fake content intended to trick people into thinking that it's other types of real people like, Joe Biden or Adrian Fontes, the Secretary of State here. He's doing all sorts of simulations to try to educate his workforce about how to spot that sort of information, the deep fakes. That is definitely something that people are preparing for. I think we're going to see a much more public-facing public education campaign on how people can spot deep fakes. Maricopa County is researching some technology that would allow the public to be able to identify whether some of the content that they are seeing online is actual information that is provided by Maricopa County or if it's fake information. Again, this is in response to so much of the fake, false information that we have seen, memes that we have seen spread over the last 4 years, very specifically targeting Maricopa County by a set of figures. And so I would expect the public to hear a lot more about those efforts and how to help, what they can do to make sure that they're not being tricked and manipulated one way or another.
Before we wind down, you mentioned curing of ballots. Is that uniform across counties? I ask because in a place like Pennsylvania, it's not. And you just mentioned about Pinell County. And so does every county in Arizona, voters who voted by mail, hey, there might be a problem with the signature or date or what have you?
They do. That's been pretty standard here in Arizona for a long time. I mean, I've had those phone calls before. I actually got a phone call from the recorder at the time. She called and wanted to verify that it was me. And I remember thinking at the time, like, this is like really weird. But this was before I covered this world. It was very common, and it has been going on for a very long time. And they take that effort very, very seriously. And so you have like 5 days to make sure that your ballot is cured. You can come in, you can do it in person, you can do it by phone, you can do it, I think, by text now. That was one of the things that is in the new legislation that Governor Hobbs just signed. Like they made some changes around that. At least you will get notification, and you will be alerted that there is an issue, and there is a deliberate attempt to make sure that you don't just have 5 calendar days, that it's not just working days that you have to fix those issues, because we're all busy, right? You've got kids, you're working, you're running in a million different directions. Now you have a weekend, a couple of weekends, like the weekend before, so there's more time for people to fix those ballots. And one other thing is that the parties, all the political parties are going to get that information in real time so that they can chase ballots too. And it's not just election officials who are saying, hey, there's a problem with your ballot. The parties are going to get that information, and they can reach these people. And in very competitive places like Arizona, in very competitive races, every single vote matters. And so there will be an intense focus on chasing those ballots and making sure the people can get in and cure those ballots.
Well, I really appreciate your time and your intense focus, to use your term, on these really important themes. Before I let you go, something we ask everyone: the podcast is based on a line from Ben Franklin in Philadelphia as the Constitutional Convention was ending, and he said to a woman on the street, "It's a republic if you can keep it." So, how confident are you? Are we going to be able to keep this? You've been exposed to quite a bit, and inevitably in the months ahead, you're going to see quite a bit. So, you optimistic?
I think we're going to be in this for a really long time, and I think we can keep it, but I think it's going to be our children who have to have their own experiences with the system who are going to make that decision for us.
Well, on that note, Yvonne, thank you so much for the time and for putting on the road miles in the desert of Arizona and reporting some really, really solid, factual, insightful information.
Thanks so much.